Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Angelica Medina with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar will be Beyond Anger and Violence, a Program for Women. Our trainers today will be Dr. Stephanie Covington, co-director of both the Institute for Relational Development and the Center for Gender and Justice, with some brief remarks by Dr. Carol Warshaw, director of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using this Webinar System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a PC or a Mac. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options. But for this session, you will want to select All Participants. If you would like to respond to a question from the trainer or to contact me anytime during the session, you should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on All Participants, type in where you're calling from, and then press Enter? Perfect. Thank you all very much. People can get a lot out of the chat feature, but there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel very distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says Chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a Media Viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you will be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call WebEx tech support to resolve any issues. We will post the phone number in the chat box. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn the training over to Carol.
Thanks, Angelica. So I just wanted to welcome Dr. Covington, who, as most of you know, has been recognized for many, many years for her pioneering work in the areas of women's issues and in the development and implementation of both gender-responsive and trauma-informed services in both the public and private sectors and for women, and really the leader in thinking about this in the arena of substance use treatment for women. So we're really excited to present this webinar on Beyond Anger and Violence. It's part of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health webinar series on trauma-focused or trauma-specific interventions for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and interventions that can be delivered in a range of settings, including domestic violence and sexual assault programs. Dr. Covington's important new curriculum, Beyond Anger and Violence, creates both a safe place and a deeply respectful process for exploring the complex and challenging feelings associated with anger and resistance to violence. Once again, in this newer curriculum of hers, Dr. Covington's woven together her own extensive experience and wisdom, the compelling voices of women, and up-to-date research to create an intervention that guides women through a process of understanding and finding new ways of relating to the anger they experience, largely as a result of victimization. Beyond Anger and Violence offers an empowering way for women to gain new knowledge and skills, to understand their feelings and responses within both an individual and, importantly, a socio-political context, and ultimately to make more informed choices as they move forward in their lives. part of what's been so impressive about Stephanie's work is that this constant learning, passion for learning from the experiences of women and for developing interventions that are guided by women's experiences, by their concerns, by their desires, by their priorities, and by their needs. So without any further ado, I turn you over to Dr. Stephanie Covington.
Thank you, Carol. That's quite an introduction. Thanks a lot. So today we are going to be talking about this new intervention called Beyond Anger and Violence. There's a facilitator guide and a participant workbook. And the work really started with an intervention called Beyond Violence that I wrote for women with criminal justice involvement. And I began to do work in the state of Michigan in their Department of Corrections with women who had committed violent, aggressive crimes. And in spending a lot of time with the women and reading the research and putting together that intervention, I decided to then go back and think about how I would write a curriculum for women who have issues around anger and violence, but actually may not be in a criminal justice setting, because there's certainly a lot of women who struggle with this issue. And Beyond Violence as well as Beyond Anger and Violence basically work on two levels. They certainly work on the victimization the women have experienced, but also in the violence and aggression that they themselves have perpetrated onto someone else. We have done lots of research, particularly on Beyond Violence, in a variety of settings, and we have found this to be, the women have really, I would say, embraced this information. And so, as I said, there are three pieces, really. There's the facilitator guide for running groups. There's the participant workbook. But I also use a DVD, and the DVD is what I want my words to do to you. This is a DVD, actually, of women in a criminal justice setting, but we use clips of this because they're great examples to highlight some of the content that we want the women to begin to think about. And I'll be pointing out kind of where we use this and why we use it. In terms of implementation, certainly in services and agencies where we need DV services for women, we know, of course, that many women are now mandated to some domestic violence programs. Very often they end up in co-ed settings in programming designed for men. So this is really something for women themselves. It's used in addiction and mental health services. In the community correctional field, some of them use the criminal justice version, some of them use this community version. Some people use the materials actually to train their staff, even though they do not run the groups, because they want their staff to have an understanding both of the role of trauma, but the role of anger and violence in women's lives. And also, I learned not just recently that there are various places across the country that use some of these manuals in academic classes where they're teaching people in psychology and social work classes various counseling skills. And I think it's probably because we use a variety of different kinds of approaches here. The facilitator guide has a couple of opening chapters about how to facilitate, what kind of manual, what kind of materials are needed. Because it's interactive, we very often need art supplies. And then there's a chapter looking at the theoretical foundations of the material. And some of the background material that's in here is really helping people think about the therapeutic environment. You know, it's important, I think, our materials and what we use with the women is important, but also the environment in which we're doing our work. And then some information about grounding and how important that is for trauma survivors, how to deal with interruptions, a whole variety of different things, including how to co-facilitate. It's really set up for 7 to 10 women approximately in a group with one facilitator, but co-facilitating is always an advantage. And then there's some tips on, you know, how do you run sessions, and we include yoga poses in various of sessions, and so we talk a little bit ahead of time with some education about why we'd include yoga and what's the value of that. So the facilitator guide in terms of the how it's set up, there's an orientation session. So many places use the orientation session as a way to introduce the women to the material, and then there are 20 sessions with lesson plans, and then there are appendices about yoga, some extra handouts that we have, and a complete guide to a whole variety of different gender-responsive materials that are trauma-informed, actually both for women and men. So as I said, you know, in the beginning part of the material, we begin to do some work just talking about women and anger. And as I said, it's both their expression of anger and aggression as well as their experience of anger and aggression from others. So these two themes move back and forth throughout the multiple sessions. In terms of thinking about women and anger, we know that some women turn their anger inward, and then there's the risk of depression. Some women turn their anger towards themselves more directly, and we see the self-harm and the suicide. And some women turn their anger outward, and this can often escalate into aggression and or violence. Now, I've been using the word anger, but we really are working on several things here, and so I just wanted to sort of specify. I see aggression as a kind of behavior, hostility is an attitude, and anger is an emotion. So that's how I sort of separate these three things out. Often, of course, they're linked and are seen very similarly. You know, we have anger in. There are certain assessment tools that do assessments for anger. One of them talks about anger in, anger out. Anger in is where the anger is suppressed, and contained anger out is where there's physical and or verbal expression. And there are gender differences in terms of anger, that when boys are growing up, there's much more of an acceptance of males being angry, and often it's an outward expression. For girls in many cultures, being angry is not okay. They're taught to suppress their anger. I'm sure some of you have heard the old saying that nothing worse than an angry woman. But what we try to do within the context of these sessions is we really normalize feelings and we normalize anger. That it's what we do with our anger that causes problems, not the fact that we have it. And so all of my curricula sort of follow a certain format, which I call Women's Integrated Treatment, or WIT. There's guiding principles and a definition. There's always a theoretical foundation, and then there are the interventions or strategies that come out of the theory, and these are multidimensional. And that WIT acronym is important, because what I often say to people is you have to keep your sense of humor. You're all doing really difficult work, and sometimes it can certainly be overwhelming. Now, the definition about being gender responsive is creating an environment, back to that environment issue I mentioned earlier, thinking about where the site is, thinking about who the staff is going to be, how you develop your program, the content and material. And I believe all of this needs to reflect an understanding of the realities of the lives of the women and girls we serve, and address and respond to their strengths and challenges. So it isn't just about picking up this manual and saying, oh, we're doing this, now we're gender responsive. You really need to look at every piece or every aspect of the agency. Then the theoretical foundation, these are the theories that relate to gender, that relate to substance abuse, that relate to violence, that relate to anything, in fact, that we're dealing with. And these create the framework of thought for the program development. And this is really the knowledge base that we then build on. And so the theoretical foundation of the Beyond Anger and Violence curriculum, I've woven together these theories. The theory of the socio-ecological model of violence, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Relational cultural theory that comes from the Stone Center at Wellesley College. Empowerment theory about how do we help empower people, what does that mean? Trauma theory, addiction theory, and I do consider addiction a disease, but I consider disease thinking about it from a holistic health model where you look at the physical, emotional, social aspects, but also the political and environmental aspects. And then also a theory having to do with best practices for prevention programs that we want to help women get to a place where we're preventing some of the aggression and violence that can be harmful to self or others. So that's the theoretical foundation for this intervention. And this is the socio-ecological model that talks about risk factors. And this model is used by the World Health Organization. This is the model that's used by our Centers for Disease Control, in which they talk about their individual risks for both being a victim or a victimizer, their relationship risks, again, both for being a victim or a victimizer, their risks in terms of community, and there's societal risks. And that it's all four of these various levels that you have to think about when you're thinking about aggression and violence. And so on the individual side, age, education, income, substance use, abusive history, all of those things, depending on where someone falls, can put you at a higher or at a higher risk or be at less at risk. Relationships, whoever someone is closest to, that can be a risk factor. The community, who and where we spend our time and our sense of place, and then our larger society where racist, sexist, classist, and homophobic ideas and practices put people at greater risk. And in societies that do not have these ways of thinking about people, we see people at less risk. So this was the model, is one of the foundational pieces for the Beyond Anger and Violence intervention. And so the actual intervention has 4 modules. So there's a module that focuses on individual issues. There's a module that focuses on relationships. There's a module that focuses on community. And there's a module that focuses on society. So I took this model, as I said, that's used by the World Health Organization and the CDC, and then used that as the framework for developing this. The relational cultural theory, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but just as a review, a number of years ago, Jean Baker Miller, late Jean Baker Miller, noted psychiatrist, wrote a book called Toward the New Psychology of Women. And out of that, a group began to meet, and they began to develop what they called self and relation theory and then relational cultural theory. And initially it was really focused on the concept that women develop their sense of self through connection and relationship. And while it was a much more individually focused theory, over the years of their work it actually expanded into a much larger, having much more of a social context also. So relational cultural theory talks about connection and development and what is needed for people to develop personal development. It talks about what happens in relationships where there's disconnection or abuse. They talk about what happens to people where there's sociocultural disconnection in our society for people who are living on the margins. And then they also talk about privilege and domination. So this theoretical perspective is also woven into the material. In terms of trauma, there's quite a bit of work in the introductory part about trauma, but I just wanted to, in particular, share this process of trauma chart with you where we can see the interconnections of things. And over the years, I've learned that this chart, as complicated as it looks, women really actually respond to it, so it actually does show up in one of the group sessions. But we can see first there's a traumatic event that overwhelms someone's capacity to cope physically and psychologically. And then we have the immediate reactions, such as the fight, flight, freeze response that we're used to talking about. But then other things begin to happen, too, in terms of body sensations and numbing and hypervigilance. But we end up with a person with a sensitized nervous system. There are changes in the brain. And we've learned that these brain changes actually have an impact on the body because the brain is giving messages to the body. Then a woman has psychological or physical distress. It can be a current stressor, such as being in a violent relationship. It could be a trigger, a reminder of the trauma that can come from sight, sound, smell, feeling, her behavior, someone's behavior. And then we see a variety of responses, and they're the retreat responses, which we often consider our mental health responses. Then there's the harmful behavior to self, and that's where we see the eating disorders, the substance use disorders, the deliberate harm. Then there's the harmful behavior to others, the aggression, the violence, the rages. And then the physical health issues that also come as a result of trauma that people are becoming much more familiar with as people are understanding the ACE study. So from this, one of the things I take from this is if we're providing mental health services, they certainly need to understand trauma. If we're providing substance or addiction treatment services, people need to understand trauma. And if we're working with aggression and we're working with anger and violence, have to understand trauma. The other piece about that has really informed all this work is this concept of becoming trauma-informed, which really relates back to the environment. Being trauma-specific is the intervention of the work we do with the women, excuse me, but being trauma-informed has to do with the culture or the environment in which we're providing a service. And there are 5 core values: safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. And this really, when people begin to try to incorporate these into their system, they realize there's a culture shift that happens. And we certainly want everybody who is working in programs with women to understand trauma and also to basically make changes in how they provide services. So this is sort of some of the theory. And then we have our treatment strategies, which are actually how we operationalize theory and the things that, the techniques we actually use with the women. So Beyond Anger and Violence uses a variety of evidence-based strategies. Some of the work is cognitive behavioral, some of it's guided imagery, certainly relational therapy is throughout. There are mindfulness exercises, we use expressive arts, and also work with mind and body by doing yoga. And so some of the goals for the intervention: want to provide an opportunity to the women to reflect and learn more about themselves, to help them better understand the relationships between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, to help understand the effects of their family, relationships, and community, and the larger society on their lives, to understand more about the role of anger and violence in their lives, an opportunity to learn new skills. There's communication exercises, conflict resolution, decision-making, and a lot of calming, grounding, or self-soothing techniques. And the women also become a group of women who are working to create a less violent world. Each session has the same format. We open with a quiet time. There's relaxation. There's a review of any work they've done between the sessions. There's always a piece of education or information. There are exercises, interactive exercises. There are interactive questions. They do some work between the session, and we close with a relaxation and self-soothing exercise. And so I'm going to step you through some of the sessions. You're going to have to excuse me a minute. I'm going to have to cough. Okay? So I'm going to step you through the sessions and try to give you an overview of the program and some of the exercises that we do. So the orientation session, we're going to talk about triggers, the concept of triggers, about some coping tools. We'll do an exercise about creating a container. They actually do an anger survey. The facilitator can decide if this is optional or not. So the women sort of learn their own anger style in terms of whether there's someone that does more anger in than anger out, and then self-soothing. So there are 5 different exercises in this session. We tell the women about what the content is going to be of the program, what are the things they're going to be looking at. Again, how thoughts and feelings affect behavior, how to better manage feelings, particularly those powerful, painful ones, looking at the impact of family and relationships, certainly talking about abusive and healthy relationships, looking at the role of anger in women's lives, looking at the effect of communities, including the support for violence in our communities. What about making amends and restitution, and how to envision a more peaceful world? So these are the topic areas that the women will cover in their 20 sessions. This is a simple exercise that anyone who's been in training with me has seen this before, but this is an exercise we teach all the women in terms of ways to get into the present moment. That when we talk about triggers, a trigger is what sends someone back in time to the time of a traumatic event where they're flooded by the feelings. So we want women to have tools they can use to bring themselves into the present moment. And so here they just look around the room and name 5 things to themselves they can see, 4 things they can touch, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, 1 thing they can taste. And then they're given a small card that looks like on their slide that they can carry with them and have with them as a reminder. We talk about violence can happen in different ways: physically, sexually, psychological attack, or through deprivation. We talk about specifically abuse in relationships and differentiate a bit between use of force, abuse, and battering. So we separate those out. They do an activity here where they first imagine distressing thoughts or feelings that they've had either that day or recently. Then they imagine, we could do a guided imagery where they imagine a container with a lid. They imagine putting all those feelings into the container and putting the lid on, knowing they come back to them at any point in time. Then they come out of the guided imagery, they actually draw a picture of their container, and we use this container, which really, the point here is to allow women to become less reactive. That when we can contain and hold our feelings, we become less reactive. So you'll see this come up again. And then we talk about how anger, again, the women are told, again, as I mentioned earlier, that feelings are just feelings. They really aren't good and bad feelings. They may make us feel differently, but we don't judge our feelings. We consider feelings as a cue to our lives. And the Courage to Heal, of course, is a book from many years ago, but they talked about anger as the backbone of healing. And so we really normalize that, particularly for women who have trauma histories. Being angry is a totally normal response, and it's learning what to do with it that makes the difference. So as I said, part 1 is the individual module. This is about self. We have 7 sessions here. We have 31 different activities, so clearly you're not going to hear about all of them, but I'll try to give you a flavor of what we're doing here. So there's a thinking our thoughts, feeling our feelings, looking at violence and trauma in our lives, the effects of trauma, women and anger, tools for managing anger, understanding ourselves. So session 1 is sort of where a lot of some of the cognitive work comes in, looking at distorted feelings. They see a clip of this DVD of a particular woman, and then I'll show you how we use that DVD clip. So distorted thinking, they learn about different kinds of thought distortions, and then they go back and think about a situation, what their thoughts were, how you felt, and then what did they do. We talk about feelings inside and outside. The question is, has been a time in your life where you were feeling something on the inside, but you were showing something else on the outside? So we talk about the need to cover up and when we're creating a split in ourselves. Now, Kayla is someone that's in the DVD, so after seeing that clip, they talk about Kayla. What do we think she was thinking at the time? Kayla is someone who's in a prison setting. who was raped and 2 days later shot the rapist. Okay? So this is an experience, not the women have obviously had the same experience, but we take what Kayla is sharing to us about why she's in the prison, and we go back and think about what was Kayla thinking at the time, what was she feeling at the time, what was her behavior like at the time. Would it have made any difference, do we think, if Kayla had had a container as a way to contain her feelings? So this is one of the ways we're going to be going back and forth using the DVD. Session 2 is about feeling our feelings. Here there are 5 different activities about learning to identify feelings, beliefs you have about feelings, learning about intensity of feelings, feelings in the body, and then the observer self, which is a mindfulness activity that we do with the women. So there are 5 activities in this session. These are some of the beliefs people have about feelings, and in their workbook, they talk about this in group, and then they would have this list in their workbook, and they would check off what are some of the beliefs that they have about feelings. So you can see, negative feelings are bad. Emotions happen just for no reason. Some are really stupid. They're about all the judgments most of us have about our feelings. So they work on this. The one at the bottom is an interesting one. This is something that often trauma survivors, if I feel too good, something bad will happen. It's always believing something negative is just around the corner. That's not something that actually everybody feels. But if you're a trauma survivor, that's more common. We have an intensity of feeling chart that often we just use words like I'm angry, I'm afraid, I'm guilty. But actually, there's different intensities. You can be angry and be annoyed. You can be angry and just kind of irritated, or you could be agitated, or you could be irate. So we begin to look at giving more language to feelings and thinking about the intensity of being mild, medium, or high. Then they actually do an exercise on intensity. So here's a sample of the exercise, the feeling of you feel really glad. Well, you could feel thankful, you could feel okay, or you could feel thrilled. And so they have an opportunity to look at gladness in their life and fill in, draw what would it be if it was just mild or if it was high. And then we also do anger, fear, and sadness. So they work on intensity and thinking about feelings. I believe that there are 5 steps to emotional wellness. These, again, look simple, but they're often hard for people to really learn how to do. First, you have to become aware of how you're feeling and just basically tune into yourself. And try to locate the feeling in your body. Where do you actually carry it? Where are you experiencing physical sensations? You have to learn to differentiate the feeling. Am I feeling angry or am I feeling sad? Learning to express the feeling to yourself or someone else, and then learning to contain the feeling. And so here we have that containment piece again. So the women are learning this, and then they have a body image that they use. It can be life-size if you want to put it on butcher paper, or they have it in their workbook, and they begin to indicate where in their body they're actually feeling feelings. And then we talk about what do you do when feelings feel overwhelming. And part of it has to do with women learning to ask the question, does the intensity of the feeling match the situation? If the answer is no, then you ask yourself, how old do I feel I am as I'm having this feeling? Because it probably belongs to another time and another place. So that gives you a quick overview of Session 2. Session 3, looking at violence and trauma in our lives. We talk about all different kinds of abuse, different kinds of calming strategies. They learn several activities. They actually do a collage on what is calming and soothing to them. The 5 senses activity comes back again. And they have a daily anger log. And the daily anger log, again, is in their workbook. The day of the week, what happened, what was the intensity of my anger, what was the amount of time I felt angry? So they begin to get in touch with their anger and to develop a somewhat more nuanced way of thinking about this. Session 4, looking at the effects of trauma, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, the questions are there. The women take that and they get their ACE score so we can begin to talk about how things are connected in their lives. Again, we work with triggers in the body, and then we have the yoga poses are all in there as options. There's something else if the facilitator doesn't feel comfortable doing this. But and then the daily anger log comes back again, but now we've added here not only the day of the week and what happened, but then I want them also to add any use of smoking, overeating, the use of alcohol and other drugs. Because we know that many women are using alcohol or other drugs as a way to manage feelings, as a way to deal with any past trauma. And we know that for some women, the use of alcohol and other drugs actually escalates their aggression. So I want them to begin to sort of chart this and monitor it. And as I said, one of the goals of this program is for the women to learn more about themselves. This is session 5. We have 7 activities here. Words for anger, all the various words that we can imagine people use for anger. Meeting a feeling as a guided imagery experience where they're guided to an experience of meeting their anger and giving it a size and a shape and asking the feeling of anger some questions. I'll show you the anger funnel in a minute. We talk about anger osmosis, that so often anger permeates everything, and the facilitator does this as an example of has a clear glass of water or a small clear glass vase of water and puts a couple drops of food coloring in. And, of course, you can begin to see how the food coloring moves throughout the water. And we talk about how often anger does that in our lives. It just begins to permeate everything. They look at their own anger triggers, and this is where we also talk about self-harm. And then they have an anger inventory that I'll show you. So here's the anger funnel. We talk to women that very often what happens, their feelings, hurt, sadness, fear, insecurity. And there's no safe way to express this, or women don't know how to express it. And it all goes in the anger funnel, and it comes out anger, rage, and violence. And we want them to begin to think about what's underneath the anger. What are the feelings that came before the anger? Or what feelings is anger actually covering up? So we use an anger funnel. So here's the anger inventory. So the women, again, in their workbook, how often do I feel angry? When I'm angry, what do I usually feel what? When I'm angry, I usually do whatever. I often express anger this way. After I feel angry, then I feel I've used anger to do whatever. Based on what I know about my anger, this is my style. How's my way of handling anger effective? How's it ineffective? If you're anger avoidant, I turn my anger on myself. I've hurt myself. Anger reactive, I turn it outwards. What happens when I use alcohol and other drugs? And I think this last question becomes, the women find this really kind of challenging. If I were less angry, what would replace my anger? And because I have to imagine if they're going to be less angry, so what else is going to be there? Session 6 is about tools for managing anger. We have some basic anger management strategies, anger do's and don'ts, a self-reflection tool, and they do a visualization and a collage about their personal best. So they use the visualization and the self-reflection tool to then create their collage. So that's our session 6. Session 7 is about understanding ourselves. Again, we go back to the DVD again, and we expand on that, more about anger, about escalation. We use these clips in the DVD where first the technique here is you first sort of analyze what you see in the video, which is about somebody else. Later on, we look at this DVD to talk about community, about conflict in groups and so forth. And then after we do the sort of discussion about other, then it's about looking at self. Okay, so they have an opportunity to look at, here's an example of when I was really angry, what happened, what could have I done differently, and they do an assessment of self after they've done an assessment of whoever we're seeing on the video. So then it brings us to our second module, which is about relationships, where we talk about families and communication, power and control, conflict resolution, and about creating relationships. So there's 17 different activities in this module. So in session 8, about families, I used the group to create a family sculpture so that we have sort of a picture of a basic family. And then we use this family sculpture to then we add violence into the family. What would this family look like if the dad was violent, the mother was violent, one of the kids were violent? So we begin to talk about violence within the context of family, talk about feelings in the family. There's a wheel of the nurturing family that comes out of the Duluth group that I use that's very impactful. And then there's a family anger questionnaire. So after we do our family sculpture where we talk about violence in the family, then we talk about what happens when there's exposure to violence. We talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and what that looks like. Another one of their activities have to do with the unspoken rules in a family, looking at feelings in the family. So thinking about your family and you were growing up, what feelings were you free to express and what behaviors could you share, and then what feelings, behavior did you learn to keep hidden? So they begin to assess their family. Then, as I said, we use the wheel of the nurturing family, and the women stand in a group, and we have a couple of them in the center as children, and then the women use the language that's on that wheel to say to the quote-unquote children in the center. This is very powerful. And the women, you know, we often expect people to create families that are, you know, really functional families when they've never been in one and have no idea. So they find this really useful to have language about what is a nurturing family. And then there's the family anger questionnaire, is looking at how their mothers expressed anger, how their fathers expressed anger, how people responded to their anger as kids, and so forth. So now we've taken anger away from just the individual, but what was learned in a family context. Session 9 is about communication. Talk about the various communication styles, what happens with nonverbal communication, how to, we have an exercise on communicating emotions, strategies to create connection. They do some work on their individual responses to stress, and there you see yoga again. So the communication styles, we're teaching the basic things about assertive, you know, passive, aggressive, and so forth. Nonverbal communication, they do an exercise where they work in groups of 2 and practice what it feels like for person A to be sharing to person B something that's important. And person non-verbally, without any speaking, lets person A know they don't care, and they realize how horrible that feels, and then we reverse it when people non-verbally let you know they do care. We do another exercise using a whole variety of emotions. We first do communication styles that are often in dysfunctional families, and then we switch to what I call the language of feelings. So that's an interactive exercise. So those are some of the exercises that are in session 9. Session 10, we're still in relationships. So here we have 2 primary exercises. We have the power and control wheel, comes out of the Duluth group. They talk about what each of these things in the spokes look like in a relationship. They, in their workbook, have an ability to make notes about what they've experienced. They also have the ability there to also assess what they have done themselves. So we look at this both in terms of expression as well as experience of power and control. Again, we remind them of the different kinds of abuse that can happen in relationships. And we have a lecture here on the violence continuum and what happens with escalation, and how things can start with verbal intimidation and can escalate into homicide. We talk about that conflict can only escalate when there's two or more people. One person cannot escalate anything. And so that means any one person can de-escalate. And we do some work with these two examples of things that can be fairly common in some people's homes. Here we have dad comes home drunk again, yells at his wife, where's my dinner? Wife says dinner's 3 hours ago, continues to yell. Teenage son says don't yell at mom. And we talk about what's going to happen here. And you can see the escalation. We can see the hazard here. And we talk about who could have changed this. What did they need to do? Here's another one. The teenage girl sneaks out to meet a friend. Mom catches her coming home and yells. The girl walks off. The mother continues to yell. The girl continues to walk away. Again, what's going to happen? And so having looked at these scenarios, then we look at different kinds of statements people can learn. And they have a list, and they pick the ones that they think are going to work best for them, that are self-calming when they're in conflictual situations. So we have de-escalation strategies that we teach in this session. Session 11, we have, again, 3 activities. This is also on conflict resolution. They have an exercise that lots of different words that they then work in groups of 2 or 3 and take the words that they think are words that help create connection and what are the words that escalate things, to differentiate the kinds of things we often say in our lives that really escalate problems. There's the equality wheel, again from the Duluth model, is used in here. And then they see another piece of this DVD, What I Want My Words to Do to You. And if you haven't seen this DVD, it's actually quite good. It was done by Eve Ensler, who did the Vagina Monologues, and she used to run a writing group at Bedford Hills, a prison in New York State. And it's a very powerful DVD. So we look at a clip of the group, and you can see they don't all agree with each other in this writing group. So we talk about how they're resolving conflict. And again, as I said, we use that as a way to sort of see something visually, talk about it, and then turn it and reflect it into a more personal experience. Session 12 is about creating our relationships. This is the last session in the relationship module. Interactive exercise about what it feels like to fall in love. What does it feel like when the relationship ends? We look at the qualities or characteristics of relationships that are intimate. We look at the qualities of relationships that are addictive. And they create a relationship collage of what they believe are the qualities that they hope to have in their relationships. Part C is the community. It's the 3rd module. There are 12 activities in this module. 1, looking at our communities, looking at safety, thinking about how you create community, and the power of community. So session 13, they do a visualization that has to do with the community they grew up in. And there are a lot of guided questions about the community they grew up in. They do a collage of their community. And then we talk about friendships that in their community growing up, who was a good friend, what are the qualities of friendship, and then what are the qualities they bring to friendship. This is about the importance of safety, particularly safety in communities. Again, there are 4 activities here. yoga comes back again. So talk about the 4 kinds of, when we think safety, often we think physical safety, maybe even psychological, but excuse me, Sandy Bloom's work with the sanctuary model, she actually talks about 4 different kinds of safety. We can be physically safe from harm. We can be psychologically safe, which means that someone is not threatening us in any kind of an emotional way, that we have self-esteem, someone's not eroding that, we're able to be self-aware, and we have self-respect. And then there's social safety, where it's safe to be with other people in the relationships and safe to be in social settings. And then moral and ethical safety, being able to hold on to your beliefs and your standards, and that those are not being eroded. So I like this idea of expanding the concept of the sense of safety. And then they do community maps. Well, actually, what we do, I want to say this too, we have in this session, that have the 4 safety, but then we show this DVD about community. And so we see a clip. What happens is the women who are in the writing group, their writing is actually taken out of the prison by Eve Ensler, and she has some of her friends and colleagues like Glenn Close and Rosie Perez and rather famous actors, then take the words and they come back into the prison and do a, like an assembly, do a presentation to a large group of women from the prison, reading the women's words. And so we talk about community in terms of there was the community in the group, but then that was expanded into the community of the prison. So then we talk about the sense of community both in the small numbers of group but in this much larger, and the impact of all that. Then they work on community maps, and they create community maps of their community in the past, community in the present, and what they plan for their community in the future. And they're able to look at where there are positive relationships, and actually this doesn't have it, but there's also usually on there, on the scale, where they have negative connections that they may want to terminate in their community. And of course, many of the women are in communities very often that aren't safe, or they don't have a positive sense of community. So this, again, becomes a huge issue. This is where they see the end of the whole, actually they see almost to the end of the whole video. And then the exercise here is Crossroads, which is about decision making. And first we use the DVD to look at all the decisions that the women had to make along the way. First there was a decision about being in the writing group. 2 was about being vulnerable in the writing group. That decision had to be made by Eve Ensler to even go into the prison. The warden had to make a decision to let them come in. They had to make the decision to be vulnerable and have their words read in the assembly. So they have an exercise where they look at what are the decisions they're going to need to be making. They work together and think about what are the decisions that they'll be making, say, in the next few months, and then they work on looking at what are the short-term consequences if they make this decision, what are the short-term consequences if they make the decision this way, what are the long-term consequences of both. So this is very much about decision-making, and again, using the DVD as a way to help us do that. Session 16 shows the end of the DVD, and here's really the power of the community, that what these women started in a small writing group that Eve was running, the impact on the larger community, which of course you see on the DVD, and the power of what it means to be in a supportive community and to have supportive people around you. And one of the things that the women write about in the DVD is a woman in the prison. One of the writing assignments that Eve gives the women is to write about a kind act. a kind act that they've experienced in their lives. And this one woman writes about a visitor coming to the prison and so forth. And so then all the women in this group also write about a kind act that they've experienced recently in the context of community. And then our fourth module is the society. So again, we're using that sociocultural, socio-ecological model, as I mentioned in the beginning, as our sort of one of our pieces of our theoretical foundation, and then have these four modules that relate to that understanding. So here we have 11 activities. We have 4 sessions looking at violence in our society, about creating change, about how do you transform our lives, and then the closing session about how to honor ourselves and our community. So session 17, they have, again, the culture wheel that comes, again, from the Duluth folks, and then we look at supports for domestic violence as an example of the supports that, and I'm sure you've seen this chart before, that comes from Duluth, looking at the tactics of power and control that go down the left side, and then what are the decisions that actually facilitate this, and what are the cultural values and beliefs that support it. So the women work on this. We have a very large form of this, and they look at filling this out to begin to look at society and where are the supports for violence in our society. So they work on this. Then session 18 is about creating change. We're going to be talking about health, harmony, and wholeness. We're going to be talking about spirals. We have one tiny piece of the DVD that we use to look at change. So I took the Duluth form you've probably seen before on the supports for domestic violence, and looked at what would be the flip side. What are the supports for health, harmony, and wholeness? And so what are the conditions we'd want to have developed that are antithetical to those things we see in the power and control wheel? What are the professional and personal and professional things that we need to do in our own lives? What do we need to do as institutions and communities? And what kind of cultural values and beliefs? Now, this is not easy to do. It's much easier to do the world we live in than to envision a world that's totally different than that. And so we give the women often, we have blank versions of this, but we also have partially filled out ones, sort of to give them an idea. And there's an exercise I've developed now to go with this to help the women begin to think about it this way, because it isn't something that we all have experienced, so it's hard to imagine it. So looking at how we would create a different world and what we'd have to do personally, what we'd have to do in our communities, and what kind of cultural values and beliefs would we need to hold. So the women work on this. And then I have spirals. Anyone also who's been in trainings knows that I like spirals a lot. And so we have the downward spiral of violence. The line through the middle is the experience of violence and how it really constricts your life, and how what we're looking for is growth and expansion and being on the upward wheel of nonviolence. So they have spiral of violence and nonviolence. They have one for addiction, and they have one for trauma. And on each one of these, they put where they were 5 years ago, where they were on these 6 months ago, and where they feel they are now. And they begin to, because obviously what we want, obviously, is for all of them to be on these upward spirals in terms of recovery from addiction, in terms of healing from trauma, and also nonviolence. So those are our spirals. And session 19 is about transforming our lives. Here we have 3 different activities. We do a visualization about transformation where they pick a part of themselves that they would like to have it be different, something that doesn't work for them anymore. They then take that to be exactly the opposite. There's, as I said, a visualization around that, and then they come out of that visualization imagining that change has happened, and the next 24 hours they live out of that changed process and live out of this new place within themselves. They think about somebody they need to make amends to, someone that they need to say, I'm sorry, and then they do a role play with each other, practicing making that amends. And we talk about verbal amends, but we also talk about how you make symbolic amends. And then we talk about forgiveness, about first how you forgive yourself, and about the process of forgiveness for others. So that's here. And session 20 is about honoring ourselves and our community. They do an exercise called the ORID, which is actually a decision-making exercise, and it stands for 4 steps. So they take their experience of this curriculum and they think back. The O is thinking back about what you've seen and heard over the 20 sessions. The R is reflective. How have you felt about what you've seen and heard in these many weeks of group? The I is the interpretive. What's its meaning or value to you? And the E is decision or action step. Given what you've seen and heard, how you felt about it, its meaning or significance to you, what kind of decision do you need to make now? What kind of action step do you need to take? So they do that exercise, and then they show appreciation. They talk to each other about what they've appreciated about each other and what they've appreciated about the group. And then they each get this card, we must become the change we want to see in the world. Now, most of us think about this as being a Gandhi quote. It actually turns out Gandhi did not say this, even though you have a coffee cup and a tote bag that says so. The Gandhi Center in India says, no, this is not his quote. So, but I like the quote a lot, so they each have this card, and they color this in and take this card with them. You'll also see that there's a lotus flower on this card. There's also a lotus on the cover of the curriculum, and I use the lotus as a symbol for transformation and change. So that gives you an idea of what is in the material. I'm perfectly happy to take questions and hopefully resolve anything that I talked about too quickly for you. And hopefully you all got the PowerPoint slides ahead of time, because I know that also helps.
Hey, Stephanie. So, yeah, there were a couple of questions that came in,
Sure.
Several about the curriculum itself and
Sure.
who is in it and who can lead groups. So the first kind of set of questions is, can you tell me the kind of setting the curriculum was implemented in? Were the participants single, women with children, or both? Is there a best number of participants?
Sure. In terms of best number of participants, I think about 7 to 10 women is best. And in terms of settings, it's been implemented in a lot of different settings. So there are some agencies that are outpatient agencies, both for substance abuse, some for mental health, and also that are serving women who, some women have been court-ordered to this program. Other women have chosen this program. The criminal justice version has been implemented in jails and prisons in various parts of the country, probably used the most in 2 women's prisons in California and the women's prison in Michigan, but it's in lots of places. Did I miss any part of the question?
Nope, that was great. Okay. The next question was, who can lead groups? Can it be a counselor or a DV advocate? How long are the groups? 1 to 2 hours each? Do they meet weekly?
2 hours. Weekly, yes. Some people run it twice a week, so that's really choice. It can be a counselor. It could be a DV advocate. In all of my material, it never says therapist. It never says counselor. It never says clinician, because those have different legal requirements in different states. And actually, it's the personal qualities or characteristics of the facilitator that make the biggest difference, because I've seen people with tons of education run these groups. Some of them do a great job, some of them do a terrible job. I've seen people with very little education run these groups. Some do a great job, some do a terrible job. So, you know, now I can even tell you the pilot project we have run with the prison version of this, I actually trained women in 2 California prisons who have life or long sentences to run the prison version of this. And we've now run about 500 women through the program. We've got about 300 on the waiting list. And the women who are facilitating are doing a great job, a really, really good job. So it's not about, you have to, you know, one of the things that really makes material work is, I think, when the facilitator believes in it and takes the time to prepare. The things that I write really cannot be facilitated on the fly because, you know, sometimes you're going to do a collage and you're going to need art supplies. So it really is important to have someone who prepares ahead, reads the material, and is ready to go.
Great. Stephanie, could you talk a little bit more about what do the observer self-exercises look like in a group? Sure.
The observer self in a group, this is a mindfulness exercise. So, and again, since we're working with majority women of trauma survivors, we give them an opportunity with any guided imagery to either close their eyes or lower their eyelids or find a focal point in the room. They don't have to close their eyes. But with their eyes open, have everybody pick a situation they've been in relatively recently that was, doesn't have to be a major event, but something that was conflictual or uncomfortable or things were challenging. So they pick that kind of an event. Then they close their eyes, lower their eyelids, and focus on it. And they focus on the situation they're in. They notice what they're doing, what they're saying, what other people are doing, what other people are saying. They notice the tension in their body. They try to get a sense of the look on their face, just basically what's being an observer of the situation. Then they remove themselves from the situation so that they're above the situation looking down at the situation. And from that vantage point, they look at what people are doing. They look at what they're doing. They pay attention to how their face is feeling. And then they put themselves back in the experience again. And then when they open their eyes or raise their eyelids, we talk about where did it feel better, to be in the situation or to be observing the situation. And almost universally people say it was much better out of the situation, observing it. And we talk about how you can develop this observer part of yourself, which is detachment. It's not dissociation where you're oblivious and not aware of what's going on. You actually become much more aware of what's going on when you're detached and observing. And so that's how we use the observer self.
Okay, great. So we had a few folks asking about how yoga is integrated into the sessions.
Yes, I had a yoga instructor pick 4 poses that she felt really related to the material. And so there's seated pigeon, there's, let me think what's all in there. It's gone out of my mind at the moment. But poses that can be done in a small space. They're either sitting or standing poses that don't need much room. And they're poses that once they're done in the session, the women can, because they're also in their workbook, they can do them outside of session. And they're all based on releasing tension in the body, dealing with places where you have emotional hurt. So they were picked for particular reasons, each one of the poses. And they're not required. The women are invited to do these, to give them a try. We're talking about body-mind connection, and there are various ways, again, that we carry feelings in our bodies, and this is one of the ways to release some of that. It's also about helping women become more connected to their bodies, because that's also obviously something that happens for trauma survivors, is that disconnection from the body.
Stephanie, a question came up about what are some of the thoughts and feelings of participants after all the sessions are over? Did people find it effective? What are the ways in which it helped or didn't help?
Yeah, what the research has shown, we've had a decrease in PTSD symptoms, a decrease in depression, general anxiety. We've had women have had less explosive kinds of experiences. They feel more able to contain feelings and express them. Many women have said things like, you know, I didn't realize till I was in this group and started this work that I have anger on my face all the time. I didn't even know it. So we've had a whole range of responses. If you want to read some of the research, the best research has been done on the prison program, and that research is listed on my website, and you can read the articles. You can look at the measures that were used and what the results were.
Great, thank you. A question came up on if participants have to have extreme anger issues, like if they need to be in jail for their own abusive behaviors or to that same level.
No, not at all. In fact, we started this, as I said, it came about because the Michigan Department of Corrections wanted something for violent, aggressive women. Well, once the women started going through this, they said everybody in the prison, in fact, they said everybody in their family should go through this. So there were women. It was actually charming and funny. You'd hear them on the phone, one woman telling her sister, I just learned this technique for anger. I think you're going to find it helpful. So, no, they do not have to have, it doesn't have to be undue aggression to find this useful. So a lot of some of the programs in the community, some places even, you know, they're working with women who are substance abusers who the counselors feel their anger, feel the women are angry, but the women don't even know they're angry because it's all internalized. So they're using this to help women be able to learn how to express anger in a healthy way, positive way.
Stephanie, can you talk a little bit more about the container exercise? Is the purpose to teach someone to learn to contain their feelings or to show one how people should not contain their feelings? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. It's the container exercise is about visualizing this container. You have the experience and the visualization of putting whatever distressing feelings are in the container and putting the lid on it, and then you sit with that just briefly. Then you come out of the exercise and you draw a picture of it, and the idea is if you have a container, when you're feeling overwhelmed, you can put feelings aside for even just a brief minute or two, and you can always take them back. They're always there, and that containment is very different from being shut down or having frozen feelings, or people have different language for that. This is, you know you're having the feeling. It's really adult development. So let's say this morning I got up and for some reason I was mad at Carol, right? So now I'm going to be on a webinar, and one, what am I feeling? I'm angry. Do I know where I'm carrying the anger in my body? Yeah. Do I know how to express the anger? Yes. But being on the webinar is not the appropriate time. So I have to have a container, right, for my anger. And then later, in an appropriate way, if indeed I was angry at Carol, I could have a telephone conversation with her. So it's learning. See, escalation happens with reactivity when no one has the ability to just sort of stop and let it sit. And so we use the container and the concept of containment in the girls' adolescent program. Certainly we use it in this program, but it's often helpful for people to have an exercise to imagine it. We also, with the girls, often give them a box, and they decorate their container and learn to put feelings in and let them move it to the side for 5 minutes. Then you can go back and get it out again. So that's how you help people begin to practice non-reactivity.
Okay, so the next question was around if you think that this therapy would be recommended for anger primarily produced by sexual trauma.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it's certainly many of the women have had sexual trauma. They've had physical trauma. They've had a whole variety of things. But it certainly has been, the women have certainly talked about it being useful when they've had sexual trauma as well as physical trauma.
Stephanie, there's a question about whether or not the group is closed after the first week or two, and whether or not you have a high percentage of participants completing the entire thing, or is there a high rate of dropout? And the person was thinking more of a community-based setting versus a prison population.
Yeah. We do, ideally, this would be a closed group because the modules build on each other and the connection between the women, which is the really most powerful piece, builds. So we do recommend after that orientation session closing it. However, that's unrealistic in some settings. So then we suggest you close it for each module. We have a very low dropout rate. Now, I don't keep track of all this because that isn't, that isn't my job. So basically, the people who use it, some of them are doing research, and of course I get copies of that. But the rest of it is people email me or let me know or tell me what they're struggling with or what's working and all of that. But dropout has not been a huge problem. Actually, in prison or community.
Okay, sorry to cut you off. How would you recommend using this curriculum in conjunction with Beyond Trauma, particularly in areas where there may be some overlap?
Yeah, the overlap, there's probably 4 or 5 pieces of overlap. Every curriculum I write has some overlap because they're things that I think are really essential, and I don't think redoing them is harmful. I think that this is a more general and somewhat more expansive curriculum than Beyond Trauma. It would really depend on the population. I think you could use, I don't know that I'd use them at the same time, but I think you could use them sequentially.
Great. So, Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about the kind of training that exists for facilitators, what the cost of the curriculum is?
Sure. Now, hold on. Let me just ask Laura this question. I don't know how much it costs. Just a second. How much is the facility guide for Beyond? Well, the publishers change prices, so I don't pay attention. Did it ever? Is it Beyond Trauma? No, not Beyond Trauma. Beyond Anger and Violence. Oh, $195.
Okay.
Hold on. Yeah, so $195. Yes. Yes, $195. I had to check. They have some things that are $215, but I didn't know which was which. So $195 is a facilitator guide and a workbook. And training is available. I try to write facilitator guides so that they can be self-training, meaning you could open it up, you have all the instructions, and it's in what we call a double column where I talk to you and give you an idea of what to do and what kind of responses you might get, and I give you an idea of the kind of language to use in setting up the exercises. And it lists all the materials for each session. So I set them up to be self-instruction, but most people prefer having a training. And training can happen on site if someone wants training in a particular place. You can also look at my website. There's a calendar, and we show where training is happening. Sometimes those are closed things, but sometimes they're open. And then every 2 years we have what's called the Covington Curriculum Conference, and that's where we do all of the curriculum all at the same conference. And I have a trainer doing each one of these, and I move from group to group, and I open the conference, I close the conference, I do stuff in the evenings. The next one will be June of 17 in Connecticut. So that will come up, and that'll be 2.5 days. So training happens in a variety of ways. And usually the training on this curriculum is 2 days.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So we had a question come up of if it's possible to adapt this curriculum for men.
You know, I think there are exercises you could pull out of this and use for men. It wasn't written for men. I'm going to recommend 2 things to you for men. I think our Helping Men Recover curriculum, which is 18 sessions and is particularly focused on substance abuse and trauma. That works really well with men, and we have a new 6-session brief intervention for men called Exploring Trauma, and that'll be available in June. And that's for men who have experienced traumatic experiences, particularly interpersonal violence, but also combat and other kinds of things. And that intervention, Exploring Trauma, is on a CD-ROM, and you print the facilitator guide and the workbooks off the CD. And I think, they haven't told me the final price yet, but I think the CD will be $150. And it's 6 sessions. It's a brief intervention.
Stephanie, those are all the questions that came in via the chat, but if there's anything else, we have a few more minutes, so if there's anything else you'd want to share, you could do that now.
No, I don't think so. I feel, unless somebody has any questions or Carol has anything she feels like, oh, I see something right in the chat in front of me. I usually don't read these things. Is the DVD included in the $195? Yes, it is. So the DVD that I keep referring to is included in the facilitator guide.
Carol, were there any other remarks that you had or questions that you had?
No, I just wanted to thank you for doing this. We've worked with quite a number of DV programs who've started using Beyond Trauma, and very successfully, both in their more in the kind of walk-in settings where people can participate in longer-term groups, and I think it'd be very exciting for people to be able to have access to this curriculum as well. And if you did this sequentially, would you do Beyond Trauma first and Beyond Anger and Violence second? Or?
I actually think you could do it either way, quite honestly. Most people have done it sequentially with Beyond Trauma first and then this because Beyond Trauma came first. They've been using Beyond Trauma and then they decided to use it. So more people have done it that way, not as an intentional choice, but just as the reality of timing. But it could be either way, Carol. I don't think that's that critical. It just is the way I wrote them, just by chance.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Carol, for such an exceptional webinar today. We want to say thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley for making the webinar run smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the Center. Within the next week, we will send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You will also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, you will be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.